Marcus jolted as a harsh grip tightened around his wrist, the force unrelenting. The flashing patrol lights danced across the car window, illuminating the tension that had seized the deserted Baton Rouge street in the dead of night. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into his skin, sending a sharp pulse through his veins, anger, disbelief, and a mounting sense of helplessness crashing together in his mind. He was Marcus Winslow, an assistant U.S. attorney, a man who had dedicated his career to upholding justice. And yet, in this moment, he found himself on the receiving end of the very injustice he had spent years fighting against. But why had the officers suddenly forced him out of his vehicle? What violation had he committed? Or was this part of something much bigger, something Marcus had never seen coming? Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. Share your city or country in the comments below so we can see just how far this story is reaching across the world. And don't forget to subscribe, join us on this journey in pursuit of the truth. Now, let's go back to the beginning, the moment everything changed for Marcus Winslow. The streets of Baton Rouge at night flickered with red, then green traffic lights. Marcus Winslow drove at a steady pace, his eyes weary but peaceful, completely unaware that in mere minutes, his life would be irrevocably upended. Late at night in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the streets were quiet, save for the occasional hum of an engine passing through the dark. Traffic lights blinked lazily, shifting from red to green. Marcus Winslow, a seasoned federal prosecutor's assistant, had just wrapped up dinner with colleagues. His mind was free of legal battles, work stress, or injustices. At this moment, all he wanted was to get home. But the sudden flash of red and blue in his rearview mirror shattered that peace. Exhaling sharply, Marcus flicked on his turn signal, pulling to the curb as he reached for his wallet. He hadn't been speeding. He hadn't run a red light. There was no reason he should have been stopped. Yet, he knew all too well, reason had little to do with late-night traffic stops like these. Two officers approached his vehicle. Officer Ryan Driscoll, tall, with a military-style buzz cut, positioned himself by the driver's side door. Officer Luke Kessler, leaner but no less imposing, stood by the passenger side. Officer Ryan Driscoll spoke curtly. License and registration. Marcus Winslow handed over his documents in silence, his movements steady. Then, in a measured tone, he asked, "May I know the reason for this stop?" Driscoll shot a quick glance at his partner before responding flatly. "Your taillight is out." Marcus's brow furrowed slightly. That was an outright lie. His car had just passed a full inspection, and he could clearly see the red brake lights reflecting in his side mirror. They were working perfectly. "Are you sure about that?" Marcus kept his voice even. Driscoll's face twitched ever so slightly. He leaned in closer to the driver's side window, his tone growing sharper. "Step out of the vehicle. Now." A thin current of tension ran through Marcus's body. He had handled countless cases like this, routine stops that could escalate into something much worse. His instincts told him to comply, but his experience warned him that these two officers were pushing the limits. "I'm not stepping out unless you provide a valid reason." Luke Kessler let out a slow smirk, his fingers settling provocatively on his belt. "Because we said so." Marcus inhaled deeply, keeping his composure. He knew the law, he had lived and worked by it for years. He was under no legal obligation to exit the vehicle without just cause. "I have the right to know why I'm being asked to step out." Driscoll's patience snapped like a brittle thread. Without warning, he yanked the car door open and barked, "Get out. Now." Before Marcus could react, Driscoll's hand clamped around his wrist and pulled hard. His seatbelt locked instantly, cutting into his shoulder with a sharp sting. "What the hell are you doing?" Marcus shouted, instinctively recoiling. Driscoll didn't answer. His grip tightened. In a blink, Kessler had moved around the car, grabbing Marcus's other arm and twisting it behind his back. The cold bite of steel snapped against his skin as handcuffs cinched tightly around his wrists. "You're resisting," Driscoll stated icily. Marcus stared in shock as Kessler forced him down against the hood of the car. His pulse pounded, not from fear, but from the sheer rage boiling in his chest. He focused on the polished surface beneath him, struggling to process what was happening. The courtroom was thick with murmurs, the rustling of papers, and the occasional cough. A tense undercurrent spread through the space, silent yet palpable. Marcus Winslow sat rigidly at the defendant's table. He was not here as an attorney, he was here as the accused. The charges against him, resisting arrest, obstruction of justice, disorderly conduct, were entirely fabricated. But Marcus knew the truth held little weight in a place where only what could be proven mattered. From the elevated bench, Judge Margaret Holloway observed with sharp, unreadable eyes, taking in every subtle gesture of those before her. Marcus sat upright, his expression composed but resolute. He was the defendant now, not the lawyer defending someone else. But within him, a fire still burned, a relentless belief that, in the end, justice would find its way. At just over 60, Judge Margaret Holloway exuded an air of authority, the kind that commanded respect, deserved or not. Her reputation preceded her, strict, unyielding, and with an absolute disdain for theatrics. The brief glance she cast at Marcus Winslow was enough for him to understand what lay ahead. Prosecutor Richard Calloway entered the courtroom brimming with confidence, the kind of confidence that came from knowing the odds were stacked in his favor. He adjusted his tie, nodding slightly toward the two officers sitting smugly in the witness box. Driscoll and Kessler sat with an air of assurance, firm in their belief that the entire system stood behind them. "Your Honor," Calloway began, his voice polished and controlled, "this is a simple case. A routine traffic stop escalated into a confrontation with law enforcement." Marcus exhaled slowly, forcing down the simmering anger at Calloway's arrogance. The prosecutor casually flipped through his notes before continuing. The defendant refused to comply with lawful police orders, became aggressive, and forced officers to restrain him for the safety of everyone involved. Marcus's attorney, Thomas Rivera, a public defender burdened with an overwhelming caseload and a modest paycheck, immediately shot up from his chair. "Objection. There is no evidence that my client acted aggressively." Judge Holloway barely lifted a finger before waving him off dismissively. "Overruled." Marcus clenched his jaw, barely masking his disbelief at how quickly she had dismissed the challenge. Rivera let out a controlled sigh but pressed on. "Your Honor, these officers escalated the situation without justification. There is no body cam footage proving my client was aggressive, because that footage doesn't exist." Calloway smirked. The body cameras were non-functional at the time of the arrest, but the officers' sworn statements are more than sufficient evidence. Marcus nearly laughed at the absurdity. The officers' words were all they needed, how convenient. Driscoll took the stand first, delivering his carefully rehearsed testimony. The defendant was combative from the start, he stated smoothly. He refused to exit the vehicle and raised his voice, creating a tense and volatile situation. A lie. Every word was a lie. Next, Kessler stepped up, nodding in agreement before adding. He tensed up. "We feared for our safety and had no choice but to restrain him." Another lie. Beneath the table, Marcus's fists clenched. He had spent his entire career fighting against blatant injustices like this, only to now find himself on the receiving end. Judge Margaret Holloway barely concealed her impatience as she cast a sharp glance toward Thomas Rivera. "Anything else, Counselor?" Rivera hesitated. He knew this judge too well, knew the weight of the injustice that often emanated from her bench. But he swallowed hard and pressed forward. "Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Marcus Winslow to the stand." This was it. As Marcus rose and walked to the witness stand, he could feel the weight of every gaze locked onto him, scrutinizing, judging, waiting for him to crack. But he wouldn't give them that satisfaction. He knew exactly what was at stake. What happened next would change everything. He settled into the chair, exhaling slowly as the court clerk recited the oath. His hands rested lightly on his lap, outwardly calm, yet inside, he was a storm of fury. He wasn't here to defend himself. He was here to expose the truth. Prosecutor Richard Calloway approached, pacing deliberately, exuding the overconfidence of a man who believed the verdict had already been decided. "Mr. Winslow, do you believe you complied with police instructions during the traffic stop?" Marcus met his gaze evenly. "I asked why I was being ordered to exit my vehicle. That is not a crime." Calloway feigned an exasperated sigh. "But you refused to step out. Correct?" "I simply asked why I needed to," Marcus repeated, his voice deliberate. "Which I am fully entitled to do under the law." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Calloway pressed on. "But, Mr. Winslow, wouldn't you agree that had you simply complied, none of this would have happened?" Marcus clenched his jaw, the absurdity of the question igniting something deep within him. "If I had blindly obeyed an unlawful order, perhaps I wouldn't be sitting here. But that doesn't make it right." Calloway smirked, sensing an opportunity. He turned slightly, making a show of glancing toward the jury. "So, you're suggesting that the officers were in the wrong?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "I'm stating a fact." Another murmur spread across the room. Driscoll and Kessler shifted in their seats, their smug expressions faltering ever so slightly. Calloway straightened his tie, maintaining his confident facade. "Mr. Winslow, would you describe your demeanor during the stop as calm?" Marcus' expression didn't waver. "I remained composed until I was forcibly dragged from my vehicle." Calloway's smirk widened. "So, in other words, the officers had to use force?" Marcus let out a quiet, measured breath. "They used force," he said, voice steady, "because they chose to escalate a situation that didn't require it." A tense silence settled over the courtroom. Judge Holloway tapped her gavel lightly, as if to regain control of the room. Calloway, unshaken, turned back toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's not lose sight of the facts. The defendant, Mr. Winslow, was stopped for a routine traffic violation. Instead of cooperating, he became combative. The officers had no choice but to act." Marcus fought to keep his expression neutral, though every word felt like a calculated distortion of reality. Calloway's voice grew more theatrical. "This isn't about race. This isn't about politics. This is about law and order. And when a civilian refuses to comply with law enforcement, consequences follow." Marcus swallowed the retort rising in his throat. He knew the truth, but he also knew that in this courtroom, truth mattered far less than perception. Attorney Thomas Rivera, perpetually overworked and underpaid, shot to his feet. "Objection. There is no evidence whatsoever that my client acted aggressively." Judge Margaret Holloway barely looked up as she flicked a dismissive hand. "Overruled." Marcus clenched his jaw at the speed of the rejection, almost reflexive, as if she hadn't even considered the argument. But Rivera wasn't deterred. He pressed on, his voice firm. "Your Honor, it was the officers who escalated the situation without cause. There is no body cam footage to prove my client was aggressive, because that footage does not exist." Richard Calloway smirked, his tone dripping with condescension. "The officers' body cameras were non-functional at the time of the arrest. However, their sworn statements are more than sufficient evidence." Marcus nearly laughed. "So that was it? The officers' words alone, simple, convenient, and unchallenged, were enough?" Driscoll took the witness stand first, delivering his rehearsed testimony with ease. "The defendant was resistant from the very start," he stated smoothly. "He refused to exit the vehicle, raised his voice, and created a tense and volatile situation." "A lie. Every word. Kessler followed, nodding in rehearsed agreement. He tensed up. We feared for our safety and had no choice but to restrain him. More lies. More carefully crafted distortions of reality. Under the table, Marcus's fists clenched. He had dedicated his career to fighting against blatant injustices like this, and now, he was the one caught in the crosshairs. Judge Holloway, barely masking her impatience, turned back to Rivera. Anything else, counselor? Rivera hesitated. He knew this judge. Knew fairness wasn't her priority. But he forced himself to stand firm. Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Marcus Winslow to the stand. This was the moment. As Marcus rose and walked to the witness stand, he could feel the weight of the room pressing against him, watchful, expectant, waiting for him to falter. But he wouldn't. He knew exactly what this moment meant. Slowly, he took his seat, inhaling deeply as the court clerk read the oath. His hands rested lightly on his lap, his exterior calm, but inside, the fire still burned. Calloway approached, each step slow, calculated, carrying the smug confidence of a man who believed he had already won. Mr. Winslow, he began, his voice laced with mock politeness, do you believe you complied with police instructions when you were asked to step out of the vehicle? Marcus met his gaze directly, his voice steady. I asked why I was being ordered to exit my car. That is not illegal. Calloway sighed theatrically. But you refused to step out, didn't you? Marcus didn't waver. I asked for the reason, he reiterated, his tone unwavering. Which I am fully within my legal rights to do. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Calloway's smirk widened ever so slightly. But, Mr. Winslow, wouldn't you agree that had you simply complied, none of this would have happened? Marcus's pulse pounded, but his voice remained measured. If I had blindly obeyed an unlawful order, perhaps I wouldn't be sitting here. But that doesn't make it right. Calloway turned to the jury, his voice dripping with false reason. So, you're saying the officers were wrong? Marcus didn't hesitate. I'm stating a fact. A hush fell over the courtroom. Calloway adjusted his tie, as if unfazed, and pressed forward. Mr. Winslow, would you describe your demeanor during the stop as calm? Marcus's jaw tightened, but he held his ground. I remained calm, until I was forcibly dragged from my vehicle. Calloway feigned surprise. So, in other words, force had to be used? Marcus inhaled slowly. They used force because they chose to escalate the situation. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't just tension, it was awareness. Judge Holloway rapped her gavel, a futile attempt to regain control. Calloway, still composed, turned back toward the jury, his voice smooth, practiced. Ladies and gentlemen, let's not be distracted. The defendant, Mr. Winslow, was stopped for a routine traffic violation. Instead of cooperating, he became combative. The officers had no choice but to act. Marcus kept his expression unreadable, though every word felt like a carefully constructed deception. Calloway's voice lifted theatrically. This isn't about race. This isn't about politics. This is about law and order. And when a civilian refuses to comply with law enforcement, consequences follow. Marcus swallowed down the frustration surging in his chest. He knew the truth, but in this courtroom, truth was not always what mattered most. I asked why I was required to exit my vehicle, Marcus Winslow repeated, his voice steady, each word deliberate. Which I am fully within my legal right to do. Across the room, Richard Calloway smirked slightly, casting a fleeting glance toward the jury, as if Marcus's insistence on logic was an inconvenient obstacle to his argument. And despite multiple requests, you still refuse to comply with the officer's orders? Marcus met his gaze directly, his composure unwavering. Because there was no lawful reason for me to do so. Calloway turned toward Judge Margaret Holloway, shaking his head slightly, as if this exchange had played out exactly as he expected. "Your Honor, it's clear that the defendant—" Marcus leaned forward just a fraction, his voice calm but firm as he interrupted. "Before we continue, I'd like to disclose something." Silence settled over the courtroom like a thick fog. Calloway hesitated. Even Judge Holloway, for the first time since the trial began, lifted her gaze fully to meet Marcus's. Slowly, Marcus reached into his briefcase. The tension in the room thickened. When his hand emerged, he was holding a badge, a small, polished piece of metal, but in that moment, it was as sharp and disruptive as a blade slicing through the air. "I am Marcus Winslow," he stated clearly. "Assistant United States Attorney for the Southern District." The courtroom stood frozen. Judge Holloway's lips parted slightly, her gavel hovering mid-air, motionless. The two officers tensed instantly. Under the table, Kessler's leg began to bounce, and Driscoll's jaw locked tight. Calloway's once smug expression drained of color. Excuse me." Calloway's voice faltered. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his eyes unwavering. "Did I not make myself clear?" The room felt as though it shifted with the weight of a single breath. The jury instinctively leaned forward. The court reporter stopped typing altogether. Even Thomas Rivera, his own attorney, seemed momentarily stunned, as if someone had knocked the wind out of him. "You're a federal prosecutor?" Calloway's voice carried an unintentional tremor. Marcus raised his identification card, his fingers gripping it firmly. "Doesn't this make that obvious?" And in that instant, the entire trial began to fracture. Judge Holloway sank slightly into her chair, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. She understood immediately: if she dismissed Marcus now, she wouldn't just be rejecting his testimony. She would be burying the truth along with it. But if she allowed him to proceed, she would be driving the final nail into the coffin of this case, a case that had just spiraled out of control. After a few tense seconds, Judge Margaret Holloway cleared her throat. "The defendant's request is granted." A sharp exhale escaped Ryan Driscoll as his shoulders slumped slightly, as if the weight of an impending disaster had just settled on him. Just hours after the trial, Marcus Winslow's story spread like wildfire. A young reporter who had been sitting in the courtroom had typed furiously on her laptop, relaying the breaking news as it unfolded. Within a day, Marcus Winslow's name dominated the headlines. Federal prosecutor unlawfully arrested by Baton Rouge police. Assistant U.S. Attorney exposes police corruption in open court. Judge Holloway under fire for bias against a black federal attorney. The internet erupted. Social media flooded with clips of the trial's most explosive moments. In the days that followed, the pressure mounted on Baton Rouge. Community activists organized mass protests outside the East Baton Rouge Parish Courthouse, demanding accountability. Civil rights attorneys began scrutinizing Judge Holloway's past rulings, searching for patterns of bias. Then, the bombshell dropped, a leaked internal memo from the Baton Rouge Police Department. The document contained damning emails between officers discussing ways to justify unlawful traffic stops, the coercion of black drivers into baseless charges, and the systemic abuse of power. Within a week, the Baton Rouge Police Department was forced to announce an internal investigation, a hollow gesture, one Marcus had seen countless times in his career. But this time, the public outrage wasn't fading. The protests grew louder, more relentless, forcing the city's leadership into an uncomfortable reckoning. Marcus's phone buzzed constantly, calls from journalists, fellow attorneys, civil rights organizations. Everyone wanted to hear the story from him. But deep down, he knew this fight was no longer just his own. It had grown into something much larger, a movement poised to shake the very foundation of the system. This was about all those who had suffered what Marcus had, only without the shield of a federal badge to protect them. Their voices could no longer be ignored, and Judge Holloway knew it. The day Marcus returned to court for the verdict, the weight of the past weeks bore heavily on Judge Holloway's shoulders. The protests. The media scrutiny. The leaked files. She lowered her gaze to the notes in front of her, but the truth was undeniable: her decision was no longer hers to make. It belonged to the public now. She exhaled softly, setting the wooden gavel down with a deliberate motion before speaking in a measured tone. After reviewing all the evidence, the court finds the defendant. She hesitated for the briefest moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, hushed whispers mixed with relieved sighs. The hurried clatter of keyboards filled the air as reporters rushed to break the news. Across the room, Ryan Driscoll and Luke Kessler tensed visibly. Driscoll leaned forward, his expression tight, as if he were about to protest. "Your Honor, we..." Judge Margaret Holloway lifted a firm hand, cutting him off before he could finish. "The court is also referring all relevant case files to the state attorney's office for further review." Her words left no room for argument. The two officers sat frozen, realization dawning on them: there would be no escaping the consequences of what they had done. A stunned silence blanketed the courtroom for a moment, and then, chaos. Gasps, murmurs, a collective inhale of disbelief. For the first time, the system had been forced to hold a mirror to itself. Stepping down from the defense table, Marcus Winslow moved through the flurry of flashing cameras. Reporters surged forward, a deluge of questions cascading toward him. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted into cheers. But there was no triumph in Marcus's heart. Because this was not a victory, it was merely the truth laid bare. A truth that had always existed but had only been acknowledged now, when the entire world was watching. As he stepped through the courthouse doors, the relentless flicker of camera flashes illuminated his path. The press clamored for his voice, but his thoughts were elsewhere, on those who were not here, on those who had sat in the same defendant's chair but never walked out free. If you believe that justice means holding power accountable, share this story. Talk about it. Pay attention. Because out there, countless stories remain untold. People whose names were never spoken in court. People who never made the evening news. People whose truths were buried beneath silence. Don't see injustice and look away. Speak. Fight. And as Marcus Winslow walked into the blinding flashes and the deafening questions, only one thought echoed in his mind. How many more are still waiting to be heard? This story serves as a powerful reminder that we must speak out against injustice and fight for what is right. Have you ever witnessed or experienced injustice but felt powerless to raise your voice? What are your thoughts on using your strength to stand up for those who cannot? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice has the power to make a difference. If you found this story meaningful, don't hesitate to share it so more people can understand the importance of justice and courage. Thank you for listening and for being part of this journey. Stay aware, be brave, and speak up, because even the smallest action can change the world. Thank you for supporting this channel. Like, share, and subscribe to stay updated with the latest content. These stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared with the intention of spreading human values and have been rewritten with the assistance of AI. If there are any inaccuracies, please accept our apologies with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.